like, and subscribe.
And our witness, Ms. Christine Bergeron, who's the President and Chief Executive Officer of Van City. Welcome.
I'd like to thank you for inviting me here today to talk about green finance and investment, as well as transition finance and transparency.
Green finance. And we have been a leader both in disclosure and in thinking about how climate change and social issues are tied together. Climate change is an urgent threat to Canadians in every province, including Van City's more than 550,000 members, and the communities of British Columbia, where our members live and work. Climate change is costing Canada's economy billions of dollars and counting. While some Canadians can afford to adapt their lives to the climate challenge, many Canadians cannot. The climate challenge and the affordability crisis go hand in hand and are making each other worse.
Thank you, Ms. Bergeron, for being here virtually speaking. It's been a very interesting study on green finance, and I must admit it wasn't a topic that I knew much about before we embarked on this study. You talked about affordability in your opening statement, and I realized that British Columbia has its own carbon tax. It's not a backstop province, but recently the Parliamentary Budget Officer came out with a report which basically said the opposite of what the government has been telling us about the affordability of the carbon tax. They've been telling the public that the carbon tax is essentially neutral in terms of their pocketbook. It's cash in, cash out. The Parliamentary Budget Officer now says that in most provinces, families will be out of pocket over and above the rebates by $1,500 to $1,800. I'm just wondering if you're concerned about the affordability crisis. Do you think that revisions need to be made, or that the carbon tax needs to be scrapped in order to ensure that Canadians can afford to eat and heat their homes and pay their mortgage payments?
Thank you. From my perspective, what we are concerned about is the combination of affordability along with climate impacts, knowing that additional financial stress occurs on those who are being affected by climate in addition to affordability. So as a financial institution in British Columbia, I don't have a perspective specifically on carbon tax as it relates to individual homeowners.
Again, in terms of affordability, in the fall economic statement in November, the government levied a new tax on financial institutions. They called it a one-time tax. I think it was a pandemic dividend, they called it, or something like that. I believe they collected about $15 billion from the major financial institutions. Is that something that you in your capacity as the head of Van City would feel comfortable and an organization like Van City also paying?
So we are provincially regulated and have various tax, provisions. We certainly want to pay all taxes that we need to pay. So that's, largely our perspective is to contribute back as we can.
But on the same level as the major financial institutions?
I'd have to look at the details, but my understanding is we are, taxed appropriately for the size of institution and the revenue and profit that we have.
I want to turn to your website talks about eco-efficiency loans. I just wonder if you could explain that program a little bit. For example, if somebody comes and they buy like a 100-year-old home that's got poor insulation and is basically a nightmare in terms of carbon emissions, would they qualify? Would that homeowner qualify for an eco-efficiency loan?
And for eco-efficiency loan, are you referencing a specific federal loan?
No, well, your website talks about a program called eco-efficiency loans. Actually, they're business loans. Maybe a home isn't the right example, but are you familiar with that program?
Sure. I can speak to some of those examples of our products.
Yeah, so mainly because I have limited time, what I'm curious about is whether someone who's applying for an eco-efficiency loan for a business would get preferential terms in terms of interest rates, fees, amortizations, that kind of thing, over a conventional business loan.
Broadly, we have been piloting various different programs and products to understand how we can support people to transition if they're interested in doing retrofits. Largely, it's related to retrofits. We have looked at pricing, we have looked at terms and conditions, but typically these are pilot projects where we are working with a specific business owner. We do not turn people away, to your question on depending on what their business is like, but we do work with them and we want to work with them on transition plans.
And how much more time do I have, Mr. Chair?
Over a minute.
A minute. Just in terms of the nature of some of these loans, for example, say a First Nation group came and they wanted to have an oil well, or they wanted to drill, or for natural gas, or to build an LNG facility, or they wanted to develop a mine on their property for critical minerals, that sort of thing. Are those the types of loans that Van City continues to do?
So Van City, in our history, we have not funded oil and gas projects. That's simply largely initially due to where we are located and the types of lending that we do. The vast majority of our book is real estate, commercial, mortgages, et cetera. So we don't fund oil and gas projects. We do work tremendously with First Nations on different projects that they might have. So we would look at everything on a one deal basis to see what it is that they're looking to develop and how we may be able to support. But if it was purely, oil extraction, we would not.
No. Okay. Thank you.
Welcome to the Finance Committee. Appreciate your testimony here this morning, and also want to publicly thank the analysts who did some good work in the briefing note to help committee members prepare for this meeting, as they do for many meetings. We just had OSFI in here talking about one of their guidelines for financial institutions, and there was a bit of a discussion around whether it should be up to financial institutions themselves to decide the kinds of risks that it would like to disclose to its members. I note that in Van City's circumstances, obviously you have some shared values along with your members that you probably have. It's a source of maybe competitive advantage for you amongst as you try to collect members, as you position yourself against other similar entities. Would you view that as an appropriate observation?
I would call it differentiation, perhaps, more so than competitive advantage. But we tried to respond to our membership because we're member-owned. You're correct. It is a very different model, though, than the larger banks with shareholders.
So really, I think the question is around should we allow institutions like yours to develop their own approaches to these issues, whether it's disclosure, whether it's more restrictive lending standards like you obviously have, as opposed to having a government pick a set of regulatory matters and kind of force them on an industry? Or really, I'm really getting at, you've developed something that differentiates yourself in the market, and now government is kind of getting in that space and telling your institutions and similar to yours how they should be approaching that issue.
Thank you. I would say that it is difficult sometimes for people to understand that although it is a differentiation for us, we can achieve all of our goals, and ultimately our society will not be any different in terms of emissions and effects by climate because of our size. So for us, standardization and broader transparency and more reporting is a good thing collectively. What we're seeing are guidelines to support more consistent reporting. The reporting that we do, we pull it from PCAF, which is Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. It's an international, accounting standard. And so again, others are doing this, and we're supportive of more people reporting and being transparent.
Thank you for the honest response. Have you had experience with or any of your members have had experience with the government's green energy rebate program? It seems like you're involved in some of the housing discussions with members about how to retrofit their homes.
I'm sure that we have. I've not personally been involved in specific discussions with members on it.
Okay. I note that you offer a free, it sounds like a free assessment, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. The government program, you have to pay about $500 for an assessment. You only get it back if you actually what you put in qualifies, and then you try to go and find out what qualifies, and it's a list of like 1,000 different permutations. It's actually very complicated. I was going to ask whether you think that should be simplified, which would make it easier for your members to actually access some of this program funding. Since you don't necessarily know that in advance, but would you agree with that generally, that it should be a simple program, maybe like you having a free assessment?
Well, I can only speak to what we really offer, and the reason that we are doing it that way is, again, what we've heard from our membership, and we try to respond. We give back 30% of our profits every year through distributions to community to have impact in our community, and so these funds come from that pool of money to support our members.
Ms. Bergeron, when we talk about emissions and how to reduce them, in your opinion, would it be reasonable to say that replacing dirty dictator oil around the world with lower carbon intensive forms of energy would help the environment?
My comments would be that in order to help the environment, maybe I'll actually step back. The purpose of helping the environment is to help people. It's about how we can live within our environment. And hence, what the data has showed is that dropping emissions matters. And in order to drop emissions, we do need to see more renewable energy in place.
But today, when we see energy from places outside of Canada where there are no regulatory, there's no regulatory, there's no regulations on how that energy is being created, and many human rights violations being taken place for that energy to be created as well. Would it be fair to say that in today's date, Canada could be a leader in replacing that with lower carbon-intensive energy?
I do think that there's a great opportunity for Canada to continue to build new technology, new innovation that is low carbon.
So would you agree that a place like Germany, who came to Canada looking for LNG from Canada, should have received lower carbon intense LNG from Canada instead of being turned away and going to Qatar that has lower regulations and lower human rights regulations? You think Canada should have been able to replace that oil and liquid natural gas with Canadian low carbon intense instead?
My area of expertise is really not in different international jurisdictions, and so I don't have a comment on that.
In regards to loans, what is the default rate on green loans compared to conventional loans?
What we have seen in our portfolio is we have not seen higher risk, if that is also part of the question in terms of default by green loans. We've been tracking our impact loans now for many years, and we've not seen any difference in default rates.
What's the percentage of green loans to conventional loans that you have?
The overall percentage of what we track as triple bottom line assets and assets under administration is approximately 30%. Give or take, it depends on the moment in time. We, however, also, our portfolio is also based on sort of doing no harm. So we, as I said, we don't have investments in oil and gas. So it's not specifically a ratio of clean to dirty, as some might think about it. It's what we track as having a positive impact in our community versus those that are perhaps considered more neutral.
Can you table with this committee the actual numbers of loans that are conventional compared to green loans, the span of how many years that's across, and the amounts?
Is a question whether I can do that today or if we can follow up. I don't have that data at my fingertips.
Yeah, I mean, if you could do that as soon as possible for the committee, if you can table that.
Certainly.
Thank you. How much time do I have? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.